Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 5 of emergency learning. This week, we're going to talk about domestic developments in the United States after World War II. Of course, what I mean by domestic developments are things that occurred here within the United States. Now, since World War II, that would be since 1945, going all the way up to, of course, 2020, and that's a lot of time, 75 years. We're going to kind of shrink it down. We're going to talk about some broad themes. Remember, the overarching theme of all our emergency learning activities have been the role of government in Americans' lives. Now, of course, if you feel protected and safe and provided for by your government, perhaps you're not going to demand a lot from your government. But if you feel for one reason or another you've been denied your civil rights or opportunity within the United States, you're going to expect your government to change and to look out for you. As part of our discussion tonight, we're going to be talking about developments within the Supreme Court. We're going to talk about a variety of important cases since World War II, but we're also going to talk about the fact that the makeup of the Supreme Court has changed since the 1940s. We're also going to talk about the effect of technological advancements on the American economy. And what do I mean? Of course, I'm talking about robotics, I'm talking about computers, I'm talking about the internet, and of course, as we get closer to 2020, the effect of social media on our lives and smartphones. We're going to touch a little bit on the war on terror. That is the war that began following the attacks of 9/11. We're not going to talk about the actual attacks of 9/11. That's going to be next week, but we're going to talk about the governmental response to those terror attacks. And we're also going to go through all the presidents from Ronald Reagan. He's the president that followed Jimmy Carter, all the way up through George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George H.W. Bush's son, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. So let's get going. Let's first talk about the Supreme Court. Until the 1940s, the Supreme Court was one made up only of white males that in some cases handed down infamously racist decisions, such as Dred Scott and the Plessy v. Ferguson decision. Now, to their credit, they were also a court that toward the end in 1954 issued the Brown versus Board of Education decision, which desegregated public schools in the United States. So let's talk about how the makeup of the Supreme Court has changed. Membership of the Supreme Court now includes women, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Sonia Sotomayor, and Elena Kagan. Just as a note, the first female justice was Sandra Day O'Connor. We have one African American on the court right now. That's Clarence Thomas. He was the first African American justice after Thurgood Marshall, who, of course, was the very first African American Supreme Court justice. And it should be noted that Sonia Sotomayor is Hispanic. So, we have seen great changes in the makeup of the Supreme Court. Now, if you follow politics, you know that the president gets to appoint Supreme Court justices. So the election of a president has potentially effects that will last for decades. And of course, our current president is President Trump. And some conservatives voted for him because they knew that there would be some turnover in the court, and we've started to see that under President Trump. All right, let's talk about the current role of the Supreme Court. Especially since World War II, the Supreme Court has become involved with the extension of civil rights to other minorities, as those groups laid claim to rights specifically within the 14th and 15th Amendments. And that could be Native Americans, it could be homosexuals. We're not going to talk about, and of course, bi, transgender, and so forth. We're not going to talk about Obergefell v. Hodges, but that was a decision from 5 years ago, which made gay marriage legal across the United States. We're going to talk about the protection of individual rights, and I'll discuss that further when we get to those cases. We're going to talk about a right to privacy from governmental interference. And now the right to privacy, the word privacy is nowhere in the Constitution, but the Supreme Court since World War II has identified a right to privacy in many instances, most notably in the case of Roe v. Wade in 1973, which said that government could not prevent a woman from seeking an abortion because that in and of itself was an invasion of her privacy. Now, of course, people who oppose abortion would argue that the fetus within the mother also has rights. Again, we're not going to get into kind of the push and pull of those arguments today, but we are going to talk about those major cases. And we're also going to talk about the court stepping in to overturn certain legislative acts and executive decisions made by governors and presidents and those kinds of things. Okay, let's turn first to the right to privacy. Several times the United States has identified a constitutional basis for a right to privacy that's protected from governmental interference. And as I just said, Roe v. Wade was a case in 1973 in which a woman in Texas sued, I believe Wade was the Secretary of State of Texas, for the right to have an abortion. Now, this was all under the umbrella of the right to privacy. Now, Roe v. Wade is not necessarily a case that will stand forever. The makeup of the court can veer from more conservative to more liberal. Presently, we have 5 conservatives and 4 liberals, for lack of a better word, on the Supreme Court. And some people believe that the more conservative the court may get, the chance exists that they may at some point overturn Roe v. Wade, and that is what one of the political parties is trying to do. The other case I want to talk about is Riley v. California. For all my students in the audience, this is one that will resonate with you. It protects the privacy of digital information on cell phones. Essentially, what Riley versus California said was that police had to get a search warrant to look through someone's phone. Let's say you've just been arrested allegedly for committing a crime, and your cell phone has not locked, and the policeman starts to go through your phone. The Supreme Court determined that given how much information is on cell phones these days, no matter how much that might help the police to solve a crime or help a victim, that does not outweigh the right of that person's information on that phone to remain private. And you may have followed the fact that even Apple many times has told the FBI, we are not going to break into somebody's phone for you, no matter what you say they've done. We wouldn't be able to sell iPhones if people thought they could be easily broken into. And 2, it's not our job. It's your job to prove a person's particular guilt. We'll talk about this more next week a little bit when we talk about the war on terror. Okay, let's move on to equal rights. The civil rights movement of the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s provided a model that other minority groups have used to extend civil rights and promote equal justice. One case that we didn't talk about after Brown versus Board of Education I did deal with. In this case, the rights of an interracial couple was Loving versus Virginia. And ironically, you see Miss Loving on the left, African-American, and her husband, Mr. Loving. They had already been married when a county in South Central Virginia arrested them for violating a many decades old law outlawing interracial marriage. So Loving versus Virginia is the case that made interracial marriage a constitutionally protected thing, and that marriage is a fundamental right, and people have the right to choose who they marry. So as a result of Loving versus Virginia, interracial marriage is legal throughout the United States. Okay, the next case, Arizona v. Intertribal Council of Arizona. Again, big name, but essentially what it said is that states can't make a law demanding that you show proof of citizenship before you vote. There is a federal requirement that you swear to be a citizen before you vote. Many people argue that when women get married and their name changes, they may not have easy access to their birth certificate. Some Native Americans born in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s on reservations did not have birth certificates. So they said that the federal law superseded Arizona's attempt to prevent what they said was illegal voting. All right. As to the rule of law. So, for all of my students, you have been raised with this your whole life. But, my father was born in 1935. Okay, so he was 28 when Gideon v. Wainwright, one of the most important Supreme Court cases in our history, came down. And essentially that required states to provide counsel, that is a lawyer, for needy defendants, that's people who could not afford an attorney on their own, who had been charged with serious offenses. And as part of that, all of you know this as the case which argued that you need to be read your Miranda rights. Okay, so Miranda rights, I thought the case was called Gideon v. Wainwright. Well, Miranda v. Arizona actually was a case that was decided 3 years after Gideon versus Wainwright, but it was related to this idea that a person under duress without a lawyer would sometimes be coerced into testifying without a lawyer present. So it is from Miranda v. Arizona, which came out of Gideon v. Wainwright, which gives us the whole notion of you need to be read your rights if you've been arrested. And of course, that's the right to remain silent. Anything you can and will, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. And do you understand the rights I have just read to you? With these rights in mind, do you wish to speak to me? Now, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not in a position to tell you how to necessarily interact with law enforcement, but that last line is important. With these rights in mind, do you wish to speak to me? Because as they say, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The next case is Snyder v. Phelps, and this is a lesser known case, but it's one that shows that our First Amendment right to free speech even protects the most outrageous kind of speeches. In the Snyder v. Phelps case, this involved a very religiously extremist church that is virulently against homosexuality, and they actually protested at the funeral of a gay soldier who had died in the war in Iraq. And of course, the relatives of that gay soldier said it was horrifying to hear somebody condemn their son's homosexuality at his funeral. But the right to free speech, as determined by the Supreme Court, determines that even the most outrageous speech is to be protected. Okay, so there are some court cases for you. Again, Loving versus Virginia, interracial marriage could not be outlawed. It was legal, as were other forms of ethnic groups. In the case of the Loving, it was an African-American woman and a white man. In the case of Gideon v. Wainwright, Miranda v. Arizona, it basically said that you have the right to an attorney, and if you can't afford one, state will provide one for you. Okay, I'm sure we're going to see some court cases come out of the whole COVID-19 thing. Of course, with our smartphones, with Bluetooth, with tracking, with Find Your iPhone, and I'm not sure what the Android parallel is to that, but it is easier to trace who somebody who has been tested and found positive to be for COVID-19 to trace their contacts and to contact those people and let them know that they may have come into contact with somebody with COVID-19. At the moment, there's not a lot of case law about this. This is all very new to us. And of course, as much as we might want to allow for large companies in the service of the government to trace our movements if it's meant to help people, of course, there are all sorts of other issues associated with government tracing our movements. So keep an eye out for legal cases around contact tracing. Okay, we're also going to talk about technological advances. Improved technology and media, it's brought about better access to communication and information for businesses and individuals. Of course, computers have made it so much easier for us to move toward a moneyless economy or a paperless economy where it's all just digital money and we're scanning our Apple Pay or using the small computer chips on our debit cards and those sorts of things. Okay. And of course, all of you now have probably more access to information than any generation in the history of the world. Now, of course, you guys know that I just said, there's lots of upsides to that, but there's also a lot of downsides. And given sometimes the effect of social media on our ability to reasonably talk with other people as opposed to shout at them. There are some real issues with these technological advances, but I just want to go through some of the major technological advances. Of course, we continue to explore space here in the next couple weeks. NASA is going to be sending the first American astronauts up on one of our own spaceships. Over the last 10 years, we've been going up on other countries' spaceships up to the International Space Station. You guys know that the United States created the space shuttle that last flew in 2011. That was basically an aircraft that we could shoot into space. It could orbit, it could do things in outer space, and then it could return safely. We put probes on Mars. We have, basically a dune buggy driving around Mars right now, collecting all sorts of scientific data and sending that information back to us. Voyager, of course, went out to the outer reaches of the hemisphere. And of course, we have the Hubble telescope, which importantly, when my dad was born, we thought there was basically just one galaxy, and we were at the center of it. With the Hubble telescope and with other advances, we've now realized that there are billions of galaxies. And of course, if you can just think about the number of possibilities of intelligent life out there. Well, if we thought there was only one galaxy and now we know that there are billions, the chances of intelligent life out there just shoot way up. Okay. Talked about communications, of course, smartphones, all sorts of video conferencing as we're doing right now. This is an asynchronous lesson that you're going to be watching at home. GPS, of course, it's such a part of our life. A lot of my students have never really used a map in a car. Why would you? Okay, it's not particularly safe to be opening a map while you're driving. I would also argue that if you're looking at a map and not paying attention to the road on your GPS, and that can be dangerous as well. But all sorts of personal communication devices have kind of sped up American life, again, given us more access to information, really helped out our economy in terms of making it easier for people to buy and sell things. But there are, of course, downsides to these things as well. Okay, and robotics. And, many people say that, in 30 years, if you pull up to a McDonald's, there's probably just going to be one person in there and it's going to be all robots making your fries and your hamburgers. And the person will just be in there to, maybe put oil in the robots and make sure that the power stays on. Okay. Ways in which we do work, telecommuting. Here we see a woman on her laptop. She's her young, I'm going to say, I don't know whether that's a son or a daughter, doing their homework there, but she's working from home. And of course, we are all going through an incredible time in our history where many of us have had to turn to virtual teaching and learning, and in this case, I'm getting used to it. I'm better in the classroom, I think, than in front of a camera, but this is good practice for me. Online coursework, we still don't know what next year is going to look like, whether it's going to be kind of part in person, part at home, or all in school, or all virtual. We just don't know yet. And of course, growth of service industries. And by service, it could just be Uber rather than taking a traditional cab. You call somebody who, may live a few neighborhoods over, and they're trying to make a little extra money, and you're able to access them all from the apps on your cell phone. And of course, all sorts of breakthroughs in medical research and improved diagnostic and imaging technologies. Now, outsourcing and offshoring, this is still something that we're dealing with today. In many ways, it's, having your goods made in Mexico and in China make them cheaper if you can make them still at a high quality. That reduces the prices of those goods and increases people's standards of living. But outsourcing and offshoring, what they mean by outsourcing is the source of whatever is going into your product. It may not be made in America. It may be made somewhere else. Offshoring may imply that your corporation is not actually based in America. It's based in some other country because they have to pay less taxes that way. Of course, behind all this, there's a lot of jobs that have gone overseas. And President Trump, one of the things that he got elected on was that he was going to bring jobs back to America. That's not a pro or an anti-Trump statement. It's just I'm bringing it up because you can't talk about Trump without him addressing this big development in domestic politics and the economy over the last 75 years. All right. Okay, let's talk about the presidents. Ronald Reagan was an interesting guy. He was a former Hollywood actor. He came in after a fairly liberal Democratic president, Jimmy Carter. This was after we had lost the Vietnam War. It was at a time when tensions were really high between the United States and the USSR. And Reagan came in, and he represented a new group of conservative Republicans, and they advocated a few things. One, tax cuts. Reagan argued that we were taxing people too much. If we tax them less, they'd have more money to spend on their own goods. If they were a business, they'd have more money to develop their business, hire more employees, and so forth. The jury is still kind of out. There are a lot of people who think tax cuts really are the way to go to boost an economy, and there are other people who argue that unless those tax cuts trickle down all the way to the worker in the factory, then all tax cuts do is that they add to our deficit. But there's many different ways of looking at that. Like most things, probably a mix of spending and tax cuts is what we need to help an economy. He was very much into saying that the federal government had gotten too big, and he wanted to transfer a lot of responsibilities back to state governments. And generally Republicans believe that big government is bad and it's wasteful. Democrats tend to argue that, well, sometimes you do need big government, for example, in the civil rights era to enforce the law. And some people would argue in COVID-19, only something as massive as the federal government could coordinate a response to the pandemic that we're experiencing. He did begin to appoint judges and justices who he wanted to exercise judicial restraint. And again, these are people who were more kind of letter of the law. If it's, not in the Constitution, say if the word privacy is not in the Constitution, then, to say that it exists there is perhaps overstepping their bounds. He also, and Trump is very much about this now being a Republican, reducing the number and scope of government programs and regulations. And finally, this is where Reagan gets some of the credit for helping America to win the Cold War. He did build up America's military. The Soviet Union couldn't keep up with the pace of our spending, and they collapsed in 1991. Now, that was 3 years after he left the presidency. It was under George H.W. Bush, but a lot of people give Reagan credit for ramping up our spending against them and helping us to win the Cold War. Okay. So small government, meaning putting more responsibilities back to the states, tax cuts, making government smaller, reducing what government, the regulations that federal government could put on the little guy. This is all part of the Reagan Revolution. Now, this went beyond his tenure in office with the election of his vice president, who was George H.W. Bush. He carried on those policies. Because there was this new conservative movement, when people wanted a Democrat, they elected a centrist Democrat, and that was, of course, William Clinton. He also carried out some tax cuts as well. All of these men are kind of fascinating in their own right. I wish we had more time to talk about them today. Of course, President Clinton was impeached for lying about an extramarital affair that he had in the White House, but he was, like Andrew Johnson, found not guilty. Okay. We also saw, beginning in the 90s, this part of the Republican Party. It was a smaller group within the Republican Party called the Tea Party, and they wanted to carry out this shrinking of government at the state and local levels, and within Congress itself. They wanted to hold conservatives after them responsible for what they did. Now, today, the Tea Party, they still really argue against that outsourcing and offshoring, which has led to the loss of some American manufacturing jobs. They don't believe that America should have these trade agreements with other countries where we don't have tariffs on them. They believe that only hurts the American worker. But again, Tea Party, closest thing you can, if you see guys with those yellow license plates with the snake on it, doesn't mean they're a member of the Republican or the Tea Party part of the Republican Party, but it does mean they're sympathetic to that whole small government kind of idea. That and tax cuts. Ultimately, that led to George W. Bush, who was president when all of you guys were born. He was responsible for a couple things. No Child Left Behind. That was really targeted at a lot of states where we had a lot of kids graduating from high school really not being able to read. This led to the creation of these big state tests that you have to pass to say that you are qualified to graduate. You guys are kind of at the tail end of it. We've had, SOLs your whole life. Obviously there are some advantages to that. It's pretty easy to identify certain schools that are falling behind in some areas. But many people have argued that making learning all about this big, high stakes, high pressure test is not the way that we should educate our young people. So, we're slowly phasing out SOLs right now. It was George W. Bush, of course, who was president when we were attacked on 9/11. And as a result, he got Congress to pass a sweeping set of regulations which allowed the government to take some powers that it didn't have before to protect us against possible attacks. There's George W. Bush off to the right. Okay. All right. Brings us to Barack Obama. I'm not going to talk too much about the first thing. He came into the presidency right on the heels of this big financial collapse that happened in the last year of Bush's presidency. It put more regulations on big banks, who many felt had gotten so big that if they failed because of poor decisions they made, it would hurt the national economy. He did a lot to help take us out of that recession that we found ourselves in. Now, for you guys, we're under President Trump, you're going to hear about Obama are two things: DACA, the Dreamers, and the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare. We've got about 13 million illegal immigrants in America. Obama believed that the first thing we have to do is to have those people come out of the shadows and not be illegal. Now, of course, people who are opposed to illegal immigration say if you're illegal, then you should be deported. Well, Obama said, well, there's this group of those illegal immigrants who were just one or two when they were brought to the United States. And so the only thing they've ever known is American culture, and many of them, English is their first language, and that we should defer deporting them and dealing with them. We should give them the opportunity to have a path to citizenship. That is the whole what's going to happen to those young people who were young when they came here illegally. That's still kind of up in the air because President Trump was elected not long after Obama made this a big part of his presidency. So we'll have to see where that goes. Okay. He also called for Congress to pass legislation to reform healthcare in the United States, and that led to the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare. Now, it's really complicated. Most Americans get their health insurance through private companies, through their employers. They don't have to go out and shop for it. They get it when they get a job. But there are lots of people, small businesses and others, for whom being able to shop for healthcare and get the best price for health insurance for their employees is important to them. Obama said, well, also important are all those people who don't have insurance, and we need to make an affordable way for them to be able to get insurance. And it went through, different formulations. Basically, he created these small health insurance buyers networks where, first of all, what it required is that you had to have health insurance. But for, of course, many poor people, getting that insurance was cost prohibitive. So he tried to set up a system where people could get affordable healthcare. Now, his critics say, you can't force anybody to get health insurance. If they don't want it, why should you force them to have it? Well, Obama argues that if people aren't insured, hospitals still have to treat them. Somebody's going to get the bill. So we need to find a way to insure more people. Now, this is not the same as saying that we're going to have one type of national health care and no private insurance, but that's something that we're still kind of arguing over today. And with, employment going up to 14%, who knows, 20% in the next 3 weeks, people, perhaps losing their access to their health care. Now, most people can get it even when they lose their job for several months, but this has become a real issue during COVID-19. Okay, few more things, and this is the stuff that you got to understand. Just with spending on COVID-19, our deficit has just gone up to $25 trillion. That's like $2 trillion increase in the last 3 months. So what the federal government does from here on out in terms of managing our healthy economy is going to be important to watch. Now, of course, in the best of times, we want full employment. Anybody who wants a job can get a job, and prices are low. So full employment, low inflation. A couple things we do to make sure that that happens. One, we've got, this goes way back to Alexander Hamilton, the National Bank. Today it's called the Federal Reserve. They're the ones who make big policy decisions about how much money is out there. The Federal Reserve's nickname is the Fed. If they want to slow the economy down, let's say that all our factories are producing lots and everybody has a job. If they want to slow that down, they will raise the interest rate to get people to spend less, to make it more expensive to borrow money. If they want to boost the economy, they may lower interest rates so people can go out, get a car loan, buy a new car, make the Ford Motor Company happy and the auto worker who works in the Ford factories happy, and so forth. So that's called raising and lowering the prime interest rate, and that is the rate at which the national government lends money to other banks. So again, if you want to slow the economy down, you raise interest rates. If you want to boost the economy, you lower them. Well, our interest rate has never been lower than it is right now. So we're in a real interesting situation. The government doesn't have a whole lot of ability to raise or lower at the moment. They certainly don't want to raise it because our economy is in a precarious way now that so many people have lost their jobs. Again, so the Federal Reserve, main job, it controls the nation's supply of money and credit. Okay. And going back to all the presidents we've just talked about, the president can promote either higher or lower taxes. And also the president, because he's kind of like the CEO of the country, he's the one who presents the budget to Congress to approve or to cut. So President Trump did have a huge tax cut, both for corporations and the middle class. Corporations' tax cut will be permanent. Our yours and mine tax cuts will be they'll run out in 7 or 8 years. Okay, so again, you have to decide for yourself and maybe talk to your parents about this. What's the best sort of policy? Determine for yourself, are you a conservative? Are you a liberal? Conservatives want low taxes. They want average citizens and corporations to decide how they spend their money and not government. People who are liberal, they believe that higher taxes allows the government to use money to provide programs that help the poor or the weak. Okay. All right. And finally, that brings us to domestic policies initiated to fight the war on terror. To protect the United States after 9/11 attacks, Congress passed the U.S. Patriot Act, and it was signed into law by George W. Bush. Law gave and gives the government more tools to discover and fight terrorism. One of the more controversial tools was the roving wiretap provision. They greatly expanded the government's surveillance ability. Essentially, what that did is we have some really powerful computers that can suck up all the phone numbers that call other phone numbers anywhere in the United States. It doesn't listen to you. It's not recording your conversation. It doesn't necessarily know, it doesn't have a name attached to the number. But the reason it does this is, let's say we do know that a terrorist from another country has made his way into the United States and we know his phone number. If his phone number calls some other phone number in America, we want to know about that. Well, a lot of people say that that is an invasion of our right to privacy. Only if you think I've committed a crime should you be asking me why my phone number is being called by another phone number. So that part of the program has been highly limited, but government has been given more power to issue search warrants if they think a terrorist act is imminent. And of course, we have the last major department to be added to the president's cabinet. Remember, go way back to Washington. It's called the Department of Homeland Security, and they're the ones who are leading this war on terror and protecting the homeland. All right. Folks, thank you. This week you only have to complete, just like the previous weeks, one activity off of the choice board. I look forward to reading your submissions. I hope you are well.